Today, Singapore has a higher GDP per capita than the United States, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Yes, a country with absolutely no natural resources that was barely a village on an island in 1965 has one of the most powerful economies on Earth. That's not supposed to be possible, but it happened. And understanding exactly how it happened might be one of the most important economic lessons of the last 100 years. Let's go back to the beginning, because the starting point matters enormously here. Singapore in 1965 was not simply a poor country. Poor countries at least have land, resources, an agricultural base, or some kind of natural foundation to build from. Singapore had almost none of that. The island itself is roughly 730 square kilometers. To put that in perspective, that's smaller than the city of Los Angeles. There's no significant freshwater supply. There are no mineral deposits. There's no oil. There's no farmland worth speaking of. The economy at that point was almost entirely dependent on a British military presence, and Britain had made clear that presence wasn't going to last. The population was a complicated mix of Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities, and ethnic tensions between these groups had already produced deadly riots just years before independence. Unemployment was severe. Infrastructure was underdeveloped. A massive portion of the population lived in genuinely terrible conditions, overcrowded slums with poor sanitation, limited clean water, and almost no economic mobility. And the geopolitical situation was no better. To the north, Malaysia, the country that had just expelled Singapore, remained a dominant regional neighbor. To the south, Indonesia under Sukarno had been openly hostile, pursuing a policy of confrontation against Malaysia and its associated territories throughout the early 1960s. Singapore was a tiny city-state surrounded by countries that ranged from suspicious to outwardly aggressive, with no military to speak of and no great power guarantee of protection. International observers at the time were not optimistic. There were genuine questions about whether Singapore could function as an independent state at all. Some analysts believed it would fail within a decade. Into this situation stepped one man who became the defining figure of modern Singapore. His name was Lee Kuan Yew. Lee had been fighting for Singapore's political future for years. He had been the architect of the merger with Malaysia, genuinely believing that union was the only viable path forward for the island. When Malaysia's parliament voted to expel Singapore, Lee went on live television to announce the news to the country, and he broke down crying. Not from relief, not from joy. He cried because he believed in that moment that Singapore might actually be finished. He described it later as a moment of anguish, a sense that he had failed his people. But Lee Kuan Yew was not a man who stayed in despair for long. What came next was one of the most remarkable exercises in deliberate national construction that the modern world has ever seen. The first thing to understand about Lee's approach is that he rejected almost every conventional wisdom about how a developing nation was supposed to behave. In the 1960s, the dominant economic thinking for post-colonial nations was built around the idea of self-sufficiency. Countries were supposed to protect their domestic industries, limit foreign investment, produce their own goods, and rely on their own people. This model had a certain political logic. It felt like independence. It felt like sovereignty. Lee looked at that model and concluded it was completely wrong for Singapore. His reasoning was simple and ruthless. Singapore was too small to be self-sufficient. It had no domestic market of any meaningful size, no raw materials to process, and no protected industries worth protecting. Trying to compete by being isolated would simply guarantee poverty. So instead of closing Singapore off from the world, Lee did the opposite. He opened it up entirely. Singapore positioned itself as the most business-friendly environment in the region. The government actively courted foreign multinational corporations, offering low tax rates, streamlined bureaucracy, and a legal system based on British common law that gave international investors confidence their contracts would be enforced. In an era when many developing nations were nationalizing foreign companies, Singapore was doing everything it could to attract them. This strategy required something that was actually rarer than oil in most developing countries. It required clean government. Corruption was not just a moral issue for Lee. It was an existential economic threat. If foreign companies couldn't trust that their investments would be safe, if they couldn't trust that licenses and contracts were awarded based on merit rather than bribes, they would simply go elsewhere. Singapore needed to be different. It needed to be the place where the rules actually meant what they said. The Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau was given genuine power and genuine independence. Civil servants were paid competitive salaries, removing one of the most common justifications for accepting bribes. And the enforcement was real. Senior officials who were found corrupt faced prosecution regardless of their connections or their status. The message was consistent and unambiguous. Singapore would be clean, and that cleanliness was non-negotiable. At the same time, Lee's government launched one of the most ambitious public housing programs in history. When Singapore became independent, a huge proportion of its population lived in squalid, overcrowded conditions. The Housing Development Board was given a mandate to change that, and change it fast. Across the island, new apartment blocks went up at a pace that was almost difficult to believe. But the really clever part wasn't just the construction, it was the ownership model. The government didn't simply give people apartments. It created a system called the Central Provident Fund, which was essentially a mandatory savings scheme. Every worker was required to set aside a portion of their income into this fund, and employers contributed as well. Those savings could then be used to purchase a government-built apartment. This meant that ordinary Singaporeans weren't just tenants in government housing, they were owners. They had a direct financial stake in the stability and growth of the country. If Singapore prospered, the value of what they owned would rise. If Singapore collapsed, they lost everything. Within a generation, the majority of Singaporeans owned their homes. That single fact had enormous implications for social stability, for political buy-in, and for the psychology of a population that had reason to invest emotionally and financially in the nation's success. The Central Provident Fund also solved a problem that most developing economies struggle with for decades, which is the problem of capital accumulation. Singapore's government had access to a large pool of domestic savings that could be directed into long-term infrastructure and economic development. Over time, this evolved into the sovereign wealth fund model, with institutions like Temasek and the Government of Singapore Investment Corporation managing hundreds of billions of dollars in assets on behalf of the Singaporean state. Education was another pillar that Lee approached with absolute seriousness. His logic was straightforward. If Singapore had no natural resources, then the minds of its people were the only resource it had. Every child needed to be educated. The education system needed to be rigorous, practical, and oriented toward producing people who could compete in a global economy. One of the most consequential and controversial decisions Lee made was to make English the primary language of instruction in Singapore's schools. In a country with Chinese, Malay, and Tamil-speaking communities, this was genuinely contentious. Critics accused Lee of cultural erasure, of sacrificing the heritage of each community on the altar of economic pragmatism. Lee's response was characteristically blunt. English was the language of international business, science, and commerce. If Singaporean children couldn't operate fluently in English, they would be permanently locked out of the global economy. Singapore couldn't afford that luxury. Students would learn their mother tongue as well, but English would be the common language that united a diverse population and connected them to the world. The results of this decision are visible today in Singapore's extraordinary ability to attract international talent, in its role as a regional headquarters for global corporations, and in its financial sector, which operates seamlessly within international markets. Whilst all of this economic and social construction was happening, Lee also faced the basic question of physical security. A nation with no military, surrounded by larger and at times hostile neighbors, is not truly independent. It depends entirely on the goodwill of others for its survival, and Lee had seen exactly where that kind of dependence led. Singapore introduced mandatory military service for all male citizens. This was not a symbolic gesture. The Singapore Armed Forces were built into a genuinely capable fighting force, equipped with modern weapons and trained to a high standard. The philosophy was deterrence. Singapore made it incredibly expensive for any neighbor to consider military aggression. An island of 3 million people would never be able to project power in the way a large country could, but it could ensure that attacking Singapore would come at a serious cost. These policies, taken together, began to produce results in the 1970s and into the 1980s that were striking by any measure. Foreign investment flowed in. The port, already geographically positioned at one of the world's great maritime choke points, became one of the busiest in the world. Manufacturing expanded rapidly. Electronics, petrochemicals, and precision engineering all developed into significant industries. GDP growth rates during this period were routinely in the double digits. The living standards of ordinary Singaporeans improved at a speed that had few parallels anywhere in the developing world. The slums disappeared, replaced by those government-built apartments. Infrastructure was developed and maintained to standards that rivaled wealthy Western nations. Changi Airport, which opened in 1981, quickly became one of the best airports in the world and remains so today. By the early 1990s, Singapore had achieved something almost no one had thought possible in 1965. Its GDP per capita had surpassed that of Britain, the colonial power that had governed it for over a century. The country that had been ejected from Malaysia as an economic burden had become wealthier per person than almost every nation that had once looked down on it. But Singapore's story is not a simple triumph narrative, and it would be dishonest to present it that way. The model that Lee Kuan Yew built required trade-offs, and some of those trade-offs were significant. Singapore is consistently rated among the most restricted countries in the world in terms of press freedom. The government maintains tight control over media. Political opposition, while legally permitted, operates in an environment that heavily favors the ruling People's Action Party through electoral structures and the ever-present risk of legal action against critics. Chewing gum famously became illegal. Vandalism carries corporal punishment. drug trafficking can carry the death penalty. The judicial system, while genuinely independent in commercial matters, has been used in ways that critics describe as politically motivated. When it comes to opposition figures, Lee himself was famously litigious when it came to those who challenged his government's reputation. Lee's own response to these criticisms was consistent throughout his life. He argued that Western liberal democracy, with its emphasis on individual rights and freedom of expression, was not the only valid model for governance. He argued that social order, stability, and economic development were not less important than political freedom. And he pointed to Singapore's results as evidence that his approach had validity. This debate remains genuinely unresolved. Singapore has achieved extraordinary prosperity within a system that many political theorists would describe as soft authoritarianism. Whether that prosperity could have been achieved under a more liberal political system, or whether the authoritarianism was itself a precondition for the economic success, is a question that thoughtful people continue to disagree about. What's less contested is the cost of living question. Singapore today is one of the most expensive cities on earth. Housing, despite the public system that Lee built, has become genuinely unaffordable for many residents at market prices. Owning a car in Singapore involves costs that are extraordinary by global standards, a deliberate policy choice to manage congestion on a small island, but one that imposes real burdens. The gap between the very wealthy and ordinary workers has grown, even as absolute living standards have risen for almost everyone. There's also a demographic challenge that looms over Singapore's future. Birth rates have fallen to levels that cannot sustain the current population without immigration. The government has tried various incentive programs to encourage Singaporeans to have more children, and the results have been modest at best. Immigration is one solution, but managing the cultural and social integration of large numbers of immigrants is a delicate process in a society that has historically been careful about maintaining ethnic harmony. So why did this particular model work in Singapore? And what does that tell us about whether it could work somewhere else? The most honest answer is that several factors aligned in Singapore that are genuinely difficult to replicate. The small size of the country was actually an advantage in a number of important ways. A small territory means infrastructure spending reaches everyone. A small population means the government can maintain genuine oversight. Corruption has fewer hiding places. Policy changes produce visible results quickly. The feedback loops between decisions and outcomes are much tighter than in a country of hundreds of millions of people. The geographic location was something Singapore didn't choose but used brilliantly. Sitting at the entrance to the Strait of Malacca, through which an enormous proportion of global trade passes, gave Singapore a foundational economic role that no amount of good governance alone could have created. And then there's the question of governance continuity. Lee Kuan Yew and the People's Action Party maintained consistent policy direction over decades. There were no sudden reversals, no populist promises that undermined fiscal discipline, no election cycles that forced short-term thinking. At the expense of long-term investment. Whether you admire or criticize the political system that made this possible, the economic benefits of consistent long-term planning were real. The openness to global markets was also a deliberate philosophical choice that went against the grain of most development thinking at the time. Singapore bet on globalization before globalization became fashionable, and it positioned itself as an intermediary and a facilitator rather than trying to compete directly in industries where it had no comparative advantage. Can Singapore's model be exported? This is the question that development economists and policymakers return to again and again. The honest answer is probably not in any complete sense. The combination of small size, unique geography, particular historical circumstances, and the specific personality of Lee Kuan Yew created a set of conditions that no other country fully replicates. But that doesn't mean there are no lessons. The emphasis on rule of law as an economic foundation, the investment in education as the primary resource in a knowledge economy, the willingness to connect to global markets rather than retreat from them, the use of mandatory savings to build domestic capital, the prioritization of long-term planning over short-term political popularity. These are things that countries of various sizes and circumstances have learned from Singapore with genuine results. What Singapore's story ultimately represents is a proof of concept. It proves that extraordinary transformation is possible even from a starting point of near total disadvantage. It proves that deliberate policy choices matter more than natural endowments in determining a nation's economic fate. And it proves that the assumptions made about what is and isn't possible for a given country at a given moment in history should always be held with some humility. In 1965, serious people with serious credentials looked at Singapore and concluded it was unlikely to survive. 60 years later, Singapore's citizens are among the most prosperous on Earth. Its airport is consistently ranked the best in the world. Its port handles more cargo tonnage than almost anywhere else on the planet. Its financial system operates at the center of Asian capital markets. Its students consistently rank at or near the top of international education assessments. From a swamp at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula with no oil, no minerals, no meaningful water supply, no army, and no guarantee of safety, a group of people chose to build something extraordinary. They made deliberate decisions, sustained those decisions across decades, paid genuine costs, accepted genuine trade-offs, and produced an outcome that should not have been possible according to almost every conventional measure of national potential. That is what makes Singapore's story worth understanding. Not as a perfect model, not as something to be copied wholesale, but as a reminder of what determined, clear-eyed, long-term governance can actually accomplish when it's truly focused on the task in front of it. The real paradox of Singapore isn't just that a tiny island with no resources became one of the richest countries on Earth. The real paradox is that the country which had every reason to fail became a case study that the rest of the world is still trying to figure out how to learn from. And that question, of whether those lessons can truly be applied elsewhere, may be one of the most important questions in development economics for the next 50 years. This is just one piece of the bigger picture. Subscribe if you want to understand the full context and how to better protect yourself in uncertain times. And the video on screen takes this story one step further.